Good afternoon. My name is Shekhar Shah. I'm the Director General of the National Council of Applied Economic Research in New Delhi. It's a great pleasure to be with you by this video mechanism, all of you at the 5th South Asia Economic Summit in Islamabad. And I regret very much that I cannot be with you for reasons beyond my control. I'm also very grateful to Dr. Waqar Ahmed for giving me this opportunity to nonetheless share some of my thoughts about the topic that I was asked to think about, which is the scope and future of global supply chains, particularly as they might relate to South Asia. So I'm very thankful to Waqar for this opportunity. As we all know, and I'm sure you've discussed in other sessions in the summit over these past day and a half, South Asia remains one of the least integrated regions in the world, with something like only 5% of their total trade happening within the region. This is really an extremely unusual situation, one that has political, economic, geographic, and other roots, but one that is extremely amenable, I think, to progress. Indeed, a study that NCAER, my institution, did suggests that if countries removed the tariff barriers unilaterally, we would see an overall increase of between 2.5% to 4.5% of GDP in the region. That could have tremendous impact on each country's ability to raise resources, to be able to devote them to poverty reduction in the region. So against that background, I want to ask how and why global supply chains have really dramatically changed the nature of globalization. And here I'm going to fall back on a very nice and recent paper by Richard Baldwin that looks at global supply chains. His view, and one that he has been talking about for some time, is looking first at the kind of first trade revolution in the world, which was powered by the steam engine and of course made profitable by economies of scale. And that revolution saw the countries of the North substantially expand their trade shares and as some of us think about it, the kind of deindustrialization of the countries in the South. But thereafter, over the last 20 years or so, we've seen this dramatic change in the way in which trade happens in the form of these global supply chains. And I think these global supply chains have been powered by essentially two different phenomena. One is the fractionalization of production, where it's been possible to break production down into different stages, and that of course requires tremendous advances in coordination and computer technologies that have allowed actions in production to happen at locations very far from where the manager or the supervisor of that production process may be sitting. It's also required tremendous advances in logistics and coordination support, and of course places like Hong Kong and Singapore have emerged as the world leaders in that respect. The second part of this global supply chain revolution has really been the whole motion or move towards dispersion. Dispersion spatially in terms of geographic location, in terms of firms, and here we've had two kinds of forces at play. Agglomeration forces that have resulted in clustering, where a lot of the global supply chains have positioned themselves so that they are close to places of demand as well as places of supply. And the second, of course, has been dispersion itself, responding to changes and differences in wages, responding to the way in which firms have excelled at certain particular things. So the iPad, for example, is designed in Cupertino, California, is made up of parts coming from all over the world, and is finally put together in a plant in China. And the way in which this entire supply chain is managed is made possible by the communication and the computer technologies that I talked about, as well as the immense coordination that happens between design, components, and putting it all together, and eventually then marketing it back into countries of the world. So I think it's these two phenomena, the fractionalization of production and the dispersion, that has really dramatically changed the way in which trade is happening. Now, what I wanted to point to next is the fact that the global supply chain movement has really taken a very regional turn. And you can see that also in the way in which global trade negotiations have gone. Doha is stuck, but on the other hand, we've seen an explosion of regional trade agreements. And in almost every one of these regional trade agreements, there's a strong component that deals with global supply chains or supply chains within that region. So here again, we see a reflection of the way in which the global trading system is changing. Indeed, in Geneva, they now talk not just of multilaterals and bilaterals, but they are talking of plurilaterals. That is, the few and the large players who have common interests, and they are willing to go ahead and negotiate a trade agreement that may not include everybody, but which is not closed to others, but where the interests of the few are going to be largely served. With that background, let me turn very quickly to South Asia. And here I wanted to draw attention, and I'm sure Razak, who is with you on this panel on supply chains, Razak from the Commonwealth Secretariat, who is the author of, one of the authors of this study on textiles and clothing in South Asia, and looking at global supply chains. The study points out very usefully that while South Asia's share in global trade in textiles and clothing still remains quite small, it has improved or increased dramatically from the early 2000s to now, something of the order of from 1.5% in 2002 to almost 4.5% in 2007, and increasing rapidly thereafter. So we've certainly seen a large increase in this trade, but one of the hallmarks of this trade is that almost every country is importing inputs from the rest of the world and then processing and selling back to the rest of the world, where those same inputs are probably, and as the study points out, in certain lines, very easily available within the region itself, so that you would be saving on transport costs, you would be saving on competitive pricing, and a whole range of efficiencies could be garnered if countries within the South Asia region were importing inputs from within the region. And the numbers are very striking here. I think in the case of Bangladesh, its global imports of inputs comprise only about 18% of the region's exports of these inputs. In the case of Pakistan and Sri Lanka, I think they are something in the order of about 7.5% and 9%. So they're only importing that small percentage of the total exports of these inputs from the region. And India, of course, being the big player in the middle, its imports of these inputs are something in the order of 350% of the total export, so that its own inputs are much larger. But again, these numbers suggest the possibilities if global supply chains, particularly in textile and clothing, can take root in these in the countries of South Asia. I think the study also, and I'm sure Razak will have more to say on this, suggests that some of these inputs that they've looked into textile and clothing are indeed on the individual countries' SAFTA sensitive list, and that suggests that they have still pretty high tariffs, and it is therefore very much in the policy realm of these countries to be able to lower these tariffs and give a impetus to supply chains in the region, in particularly textile and clothing. With that, let me just then end with one final sense of where I think and what I think will influence global supply chains overall, and therefore how these might play out in the region. I think there are 4 or 5 factors that are important as we look to the future of how global supply chains will move. I should mention here that I think, as Baldwin has reminded us, it's no longer just goods and services moving across borders. It's really now a very close nexus between trade in these things, investment, foreign direct investment in particular, services like BPO and computer services, and IP, knowledge that needs to be bundled together in some sense. And only when countries address the regimes that affect each of these factors, trade, investment, services, and IP, that they can be open to the kind of global supply chains that we see in parts of the world. The parts that are most obvious are, of course, the factory Asia idea, the factory North America idea, the factory Europe idea. And so I think it's high time that we begin to think about a factory South Asia idea. The time is right, and I think the countries are prepared. So let me turn to these 4 or 5 factors that I think are going to importantly influence global supply chains. First, I think, is the improvement that we are seeing, and I think we are going to see an acceleration of this in coordination technology, largely driven by computers, but also with internet access and penetration increasing dramatically in our countries. We're going to see within South Asia a tremendous potential for the increase in coordination technology, improving the prospects for global supply chains or regional supply chains in the region. Second, I think also related to technology, is integrating computers and numerical controls in manufacturing. We are seeing a lot of this already. The famous examples of surgeons operating remotely in locations where they can possibly divide the time and with robotic surgical machines that are operating at a significant distance from them. There are many such examples that we know of where integrating computers into a service or a manufacturing process is dramatically improving the prospects for supply chains. The third and a strongly economic factor here is going to be the compression of wages across the world, particularly the decline in the wage gap between China and the countries of the North. With that happening, I think we have now another round of the kind of flying geese phenomenon that we saw back in the 60s and 70s, with Japan moving to more advanced stages of production and creating the room for its Asian neighbors to follow Japan in a kind of flying geese pattern, Taiwan, Korea, others. And similarly now, we will, I think, see China vacating some of the spots that it has held in manufacturing and vacating those spots for countries, particularly those countries in South Asia. And finally, I think, of course, the big unknown, the price of oil, because that has an important influence on transport costs, therefore on the incentives to innovate in new technologies, new coordination methods. But with all this, I think the prospects for global supply chains are very bright. It requires forward thinking. It requires kind of liberating oneself from the trade concerns of the 20th century and moving into the trade concerns of the 21st century. As a recent article, I think, in The Economist said, the way in which these things are developing, we will soon see, as the article pointed out, the word man coming out of manufacturing, so that it is no longer, as used to be the case, machines helping workers to make things, but it will now be workers helping machines to make them. With that, let me stop. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be addressing you. I wish this session and indeed the entire summit a great deal of success, and thank you for listening to me.